So how would a potential British exit from the European Union impact the United States? Joining us right now from London is former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, AEI Senior Fellow and Fox News contributor, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, good to see you, sir.
Glad to be with you.
Impact on the United States. How do you see it?
Well, I think it would be a positive for the United States, primarily from the security point of view, but I think from an economic point of view. I think for Britain to break away from the European Union, you know, you had a former German Minister of Economics on who took words out of my mouth. Defending the EU, he described it as sclerotic and undemocratic. I think a free Britain would actually be a big plus. I think quite the opposite of what Barack Obama said, putting Britain at the back of the queue. I think the U.S. should come stand beside their best ally in Europe, have an immediate free trade agreement and do whatever else we could to help them. But to me, the more important issue is on the security side. I've never seen this referendum as primarily about economics. I think it's about self-government and sovereignty and security of the West. And here, the European Union is less than the sum of its parts. I think an independent Britain would be entirely to the good.
It's a really important point that if we were to see the vote go that way, that Britain would leave, what does the U.S. do? Does the U.S. immediately go and support the Brits? Now, presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump came on the program yesterday, and I asked him about this. Listen to what he said about today's votes. It's very much in step with what you're saying.
And I'll be over there just as it's the decision's coming in. I mean, I would, you know, I don't think anybody should listen to me because I haven't really focused on it very much, but my inclination would be to get out because, you know, just go it alone. It's a mess. There's such a mess over. When you look at what's happened with as an example, the migration, when you look at the things that are going on over there, my inclination would be go it alone and go back to where you came from because that's, you know, just my feeling. Now, with that being said, I want people to do what they want to do. But, you know, somebody asked me, what would you do? I said, I would probably vote to get out.
So, Ambassador, you said it would be good for security. Why? Because you think that the U.K. would immediately do more strengthening of its borders? Is that why it would be good for security?
Well, I'm thinking more in terms of NATO. You know, many political leaders in the European Union have always seen the EU as fundamentally a political project, and they believe that creating a European superstate would create an alternative pole in world affairs. In a multipolar world, there'd be Europe, separate from the United States. I think that undercuts NATO. I think it leads to a diminution of Western strength around the world. And I think a Britain that extricated itself from the swamp of EU decision-making would also help us strengthen NATO. And one other thing people need to consider, that, you know, the business community talks about the uncertainty of Brexit. There's a boatload of certainty of staying in the European Union. And if Britain leaves, the European Union you see today will not only lose its second biggest economy and 1/6 of the total EU economy, there will be a series of demands for referenda in plenty of other European countries. The EU will be fundamentally different in the future, and I think that will be better for the West as well.
Ambassador, if Great Britain decides to stay, if the vote is to stay, do you see an outcome where there's actually a lot of reform in the EU, that it actually forces them to change things so they do stay, but the EU kind of figures it out or goes down a better path for long-term growth within the EU?
It's possible, but very unlikely. I think, actually, if the Brits vote to leave today, on Friday morning, many European leaders will be on their knees begging England not to go, begging Britain not to go. So if you want to redo the European Union and make reforms, far better if you have the leverage of threatening to pull out entirely. And I think across the European Union, you know, somebody's going to say, who made the mistake of letting the peasants vote in Britain? This has always been an elite enterprise, and I think all across Europe, in country after country, the middle classes, the blue-collar workers are going to say, well, if they can do that in Britain, let's have a shot at it here. That's what these people are really worried about. This is a theology about the European Union, and they see it threatened by this British vote.
Ambassador, what about the argument which the Wall Street Journal editorial page stands on, not James Freeman, who's sitting here, but the other members of the editorial board, that the U.S. would somehow be better off if Britain stayed in the European Union because they would be part in directing financial regulations, in promoting freer trade among that bloc of nations?
Look, Norman Lamont, a former chancellor of the Exchequer here, did a little tabulation of 72 key issues over the years where Britain has differed from most European Union nations. And the record of British success is they are 0-72. And I've talked to members of Parliament here who think that understates how bad it is. It is a myth to think that Britain acts to influence the European Union. This is a super state under construction. It's largely a German superstate because it reflects the dominant economy. And that's why I think many other countries, seeing the Brits escape this very, it may not be sinking ship, but it's a very listing ship, are going to want to try and do the same. And that's why this vote is so important. It's not just about Britain. Really, it's about the entire European Union, and it's about this notion of supranational governance, which, of course, most people in the United States don't cotton to either.
Who weakens if, in fact, the UK leaves? The EU, you're saying, is going to have issues, but are there countries that are more poised than others to really feel the impact?
Well, I think if you look at the balance of trade, it favors continental Europe, which is why, interestingly, the head of the German Business Confederation said yesterday that if the Brits vote today to leave, German business will insist that the terms of trade remain the same until they can negotiate an orderly separation, because British imports from Germany are such an important element of German business. And I think business leaders all over the continent feel the same way. The notion that many who oppose British exit have, that suddenly a wall will spring up in the English Channel, that commerce will stop, and that all the effects will be negative, don't appreciate how interlinked it is. And even if Britain separates from the political project, I think the odds are that trade and investment will remain essentially unaffected over the longer term.
Ambassador James Freeman here. I like your idea of bringing the British into NAFTA, a free trade agreement here. We'd have to probably talk President Trump into that. I think he's not immediately amenable. But let's look at the other scenario, which is they vote to leave, and then they start talking some more, and maybe Boris Johnson takes over in the UK. What is your kind of best case scenario on that end for what kind of a deal Britain can cut, what kind of reforms they can drive in the EU if they initially vote to leave?
Well, I think this is the point of maximum leverage, but I don't think it would be used as a negotiating tool. I think once Britain decides to go, it's going to go. Whether David Cameron could stay as Prime Minister or not is very much open to question. I think many in the Conservative Party wanting to leave because they don't trust that he'll negotiate effectively for exit. Let's be clear, I know the British civil service well. I've dealt with it. They hate the idea of exit. You need a Prime Minister who's going to drive them to do what the sovereign British people will have decided. So there will be political turmoil. There will be economic turmoil. But, you know, it's the same argument as whenever you make a big change like this, there are going to be transaction costs. There are going to be intermediate bumps in the road. The question is the bigger issue about whether freedom works in the long term and whether a Britain free of the EU that might drastically decrease its economic regulations, cut taxes, really be a free market country, and what that might do for the British economy. That's the real contrast that needs to be drawn.
All right, we will leave it there. Ambassador, good to speak with you. Thanks so much.
Glad to be with you.
Ambassador John Bolton.